Hello, and welcome to Creative Banter, a creativity and philosophy-focused podcast where anything goes. I'm your host, Cody Schultz. Joining me is the one and only Ben Horn. From our Patreon launching officially, to naming photographs, to limited editions, and the idea of too many photographs, there's a lot going on in this episode. So buckle up, grab a cup of coffee, and let's dive right into it, shall we? And the Patreon is officially live.
It is.
Officially set that up. I actually released it this past Wednesday, so the 13th episode has a link to it. And I was kind of curious to see if anyone would pay attention to that. And I added the little new outro that we did and ended up with a couple people that have started to contribute already, which is always nice to see.
Yeah, it's exciting to see because it just, I don't know, it helps to, I think, reinforce the fact that we're onto something kind of fun here that people enjoy, and so it'll be interesting to see where things go, and it's a sort of thing where since we're new to it, we'll figure out things to post there, maybe certain topics, and we'll have some sort of other stuff along the line, stuff that pertains to the various episodes. So it'll be just a collective place to put all that. And
yeah, I think I have about 5 or 6 bonus episodes, just short, like 5-10 minute clips that if I would have kept them in the regular episodes, it would have been a little bit too long for how I like to keep things.
That's
when
cool.
I'm editing. So I have those that'll start to push out, probably start around with this episode or so. And that also means that we will start discussions for this episode and for the following ones on there as well. So if anyone listening wants to hop on, I will make sure that there is a post for episode 15 going forward. If you have any questions, if you want to say anything about the show or whatever, and I'll make sure that I keep an eye on that, and that's open to anyone, whether you contribute or just want to see what's going on.
Yeah, so it'll be kind of like a bulletin board to put stuff related to the podcast, and maybe if there's some things we discuss, some visual stuff, we can have it on there so people can check that out as well.
Yeah, definitely. Make things a little bit easier than the show notes on like Spotify and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Which, speaking of that, I hopped over. I don't use like Apple Podcasts or anything. I'm typically using Spotify for all of my stuff. But you had mentioned about because of us changing the graphic, the logo, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
And how that had gotten messed up or something, I think. But I hopped over to Apple Podcasts just to make sure that changed around or what was going on with that, and I saw that we had a couple of reviews on there, and that was, talk about heartwarming. It's always fun to see too.
Yeah, especially when they're positive ones.
Well, yeah, of course. It wouldn't be so heartwarming with the negative ones, but I mean,
Yeah,
hey, I mean, no such thing as bad publicity, as they say.
I guess.
So,
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I saw those as well. So that was very cool to see. And I didn't, I don't have them in front of me right now, but I didn't immediately recognize the names, which was interesting, because there's certainly a core group of people that I know pay attention to your stuff and my stuff, and oftentimes I'll recognize the names right away. I'll have to go back to it and look at them again, but just off the top of my head, I remember thinking that it wasn't names that I immediately recognized. But perhaps they will now become familiar names, which is pretty nice.
Yeah, like you, I didn't really recognize them. But then again, people create weird usernames that aren't always consistent, so could end up being someone that one of us knows and recognizes, but just doesn't recognize that name
Yeah.
that they used. So,
Very-
but yeah, so that is always fun stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So, what topics do you have in mind for this week, Cody?
I was listening to an episode of Matt Payne's podcast, F-Stop, Collaborate, and Listen.
Mm-hmm.
And he had just recently released an interview with Richard Boutwell, who is a photographer right around my area, is where he lives these days.
Mm-hmm.
And he had mentioned in there about the idea of titling photographs and what happens when you give a photograph a name and how that affects how an individual views that photograph.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you add a name, say something like Silent Spring to a photograph, that's going to put some new sort of meaning to that image that someone may not have recognized when they first viewed it had they not seen that photograph.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to get your thoughts on the whole principle of naming photographs, because it's something that I've always struggled with. I mean, sometimes a photograph's name will just kind of come to me and it will just be titled as such, but a lot of times I'll end up struggling for a while to try and figure out a name. And the whole principle of naming photographs is it feels kind of new, because like you look back at Ansel Adams and a lot of his were just kind of aspen tree in Yosemite.
Yeah.
Kind of real basic kind of things.
So for the photos that you have, how many of them do you think you thought of a name while still in the field versus afterwards?
Maybe one or two.
Okay.
Yeah.
I find that for the most part, many of my photos, I come up with the name afterwards. It usually is a little bit of a last minute sort of situation that I come up with a name, which I think is probably something that perhaps many photographers can relate to, because at some point, I'm going to put that image on my website and I have to give it a name. I for whatever reason in our current society, everything has to have a name, and it almost sounds kind of strange in a way that everything must have a name.
And my thing with it was that it just helps with marketing.
It's true.
Where, like, you go onto a website, because if someone's able to associate a name to something, they're able to more easily share it with others.
Yeah.
You're not going to be going around and saying, "Oh, I really like Ben Horn's photograph 02374." It's more so going to be the name of the photograph. It's just easier to remember, I think.
Yeah.
So I think that's why the tradition kind of started off, but it's still tough.
Yeah. And there's times when I do think of a name for a photo while I'm in the field, though I try not to do that too much, just because I feel like I'm cursing that image. I feel like it's kind of the whole counting your chickens before they hatch. I'm trying to recall, on this podcast, have I ever told the tale of Thunder Maple?
I don't recall.
It'll be super short. But when I was in Zion in 2018, there's this really cool looking maple tree in full fall color. There was a thunderstorm overhead. It was raining. There was lightning. There was thunder. It was like the best sort of experience in the field in terms of the sound, the smells, everything. And I took a picture of this maple tree in these conditions, and in my mind, I'm like, this is Thunder Maple. This is like the perfect name for this maple tree. And when I saw that film, it was like the worst photo I've ever taken. So for me, if I come up with especially a really cool name, I feel like I'm cursing that image in the field. So I try to scale things down a little bit now. I did end up giving that name to another image I had shot that looks like there's some like barren branches that look like they're bolts of lightning. So I call that one Thunder Maple now. So I did find a way of using that name afterwards.
I think it's also not helpful when you put a name to an image in the field when you're working with film, especially.
That's true.
Because you don't have that immediate feedback.
Yeah.
So you can't just look and see, okay, yeah, this is going to be a keeper, or I can work with this kind of thing.
Yeah.
Whereas, like for me, I actually have a list in front of me, and that's where Silent Spring came from.
Mm-hmm.
Just a short list, and I stopped adding to it quite a while ago, but just of titles that just came to me, and they have no, like, place. They have no photograph that they belong to.
Huh. That's a very interesting aspect that I've not thought of, basically having the potential titles listed, ahead of capturing the images. Do you think that with that list in mind, that has in any way helped you to find some subjects that you may not have without that? I mean, I'm trying to think of how that might play into it.
I'm not, like I said, I haven't added to it at all this year, actually. There's a good side to it and a bad side, and I think the bad side to it is that now you're adding a title that's already conceived and already has its own meaning to a photograph that it might not necessarily fit with, like 100%.
Yeah.
But the good side of it is that if I'm struggling with a title and I read through this list and I see one that does fit and that I can make work, then it lowers the quote-unquote stress that you kind of come up with of when you're struggling to figure something out.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure how to feel about it anymore. It was one of those deals where I was photographing a lot more with 6x7 film, so each year I was coming out with more photographs. Whether they were good or not is a totally different topic, but so I was needing more titles, and a lot of them were of like the farmland around me.
Mm-hmm.
So it just kind of worked out that I'd have a lot more.
Yeah.
But yeah, I've thought for a long while that I would love to figure out a way to just not title my work. Just to have it titled very simplistically, or very descriptively, almost,
Mm-hmm.
I should say. Kind of like how Ansel Adams and the photographers of Eld used to do it.
Yeah.
But then at the same time, you're like, well, a lot of the photographs that I take are right in the same area.
That's
like,
true.
The majority of my photographs in my portfolio are taken from up at my family's cabin.
Yeah.
So what, everything's going to be...
Just put a number after it now,
Yeah, it's going to be Nort's Resort number 35.
Yeah. But that sounds a
Or
lot
like
more artsy in a way, I think that would give street cred for the high-end art world.
Yeah, I mean, I could see that like a museum or like high-end art gallery might like that more than Silent Spring, but
yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
It's like I said, it's all marketing voodoo anyway, so
yeah,
I don't think it...
For me, when it comes to naming the images, ultimately it's when I put the photo on my website that I do, finally put a name on it. I sometimes change it after the fact, but I need to give it something. And usually it has to do with tying into something about that image that perhaps gives another level or draws the viewer's attention to something. Oftentimes it's descriptive, but not in a literal sense, but more so of what that image is, at least in my mind, trying to convey. And oftentimes I'll give it just like a one-word title, if possible, if I can think of just like one word that really seems to describe what it was that I had in mind or draw some of their aspect to it. There's one of the first photos that that I can think of in terms of when I started naming them beyond just literal things. It was two pine trees that are sort of twisted into each other along a really beautiful sandstone wall and reflected light is in Zion. It's a vertical photo. And I called it Embrace because it looks like one tree is embracing the other tree, which takes it beyond the literal aspect of it just being two pine trees that happen to sprout in the same area, and technically they're probably competing for light and competing for nutrients and such. But it seems to humanize them a little bit, which draws more emotional value to the image. And I think that's the approach that I take when naming them, is trying to tie into the artistic side what it is I'm trying to express with them. But there are also those photos that it's difficult. I don't quite know what it is I'm trying to express with it, other than it's just a beautiful scene. And my go-to for that is just to name it, some sort of noun, an ampersand, and then another noun. So it might be like leaf and rock, or it's something like that. It sounds like some sort of like high-end kind of hipster sort of boutique place. But I have a lot of those in my portfolio that are something and something else. And maybe also because it's hard to describe it and to distill it down to just a simple title.
Yeah, I try to keep all of mine as simple as I can. I mean, thinking with the Smokies and the photographs that I kept from that, and I have mountain light and rhododendron and roots. I mean, that's as descriptive and simple as you can get.
Yeah.
Because, like you said, there's an emotional influence that a title has on anything or any photograph that you put out there. So I think simple titles kind of they can help with that emotional aspect, but they can also help keep people less influenced too, in a way.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a way of kind of just giving that extra little bit of information to perhaps help with the viewing experience, but also I think if a title is a make or break part of the image, like if a person doesn't get the image without the title, then perhaps the image isn't as strong as it should be. I think it should complement it, but it shouldn't like completely alter the way that we view it, perhaps. But I don't know, maybe not. I guess it depends on the image.
You had mentioned about changing titles like after you have already put them online.
Mm-hmm.
So all of your prints are limited editions.
Yeah.
Okay. What do you give out like a certificate of authenticity with those, or like how do you run your limited editions? Because I know with a lot of people they'll do a certificate of authenticity, and on that has the title of the piece. So I can imagine it being a little difficult to alter a photograph's title after you have already sold a print. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do, and I don't do the certificates of authenticity. To me, I feel they're kind of useless. I think it kind of gets into the cheesy category, because if it's legitimately a certificate of authenticity, it's like, dude, you bought it from me. I don't think we need a certificate to prove that. I know it's something that's more common, like in the art world, if a person is going to resell that or whatever, but that's not going to be happening with my images. So yeah,
I think it also had to do with insurance for like if you're buying like a multi-million-dollar piece of art,
yeah,
and you put it in storage and then something happens to your storage locker or whatever, then you have that proof that you were the owner at that point. I think that's kind of, but at the same time, it's just more of like a highfalutin kind of thing.
yeah.
Like
Yeah.
I used to do them when I was running my art shows. I'd give out certificates of authenticity to the limited edition prints, but it was just because the people that I was under the influence of were doing the same thing that I were doing that same thing.
Yeah.
So I just kind of followed in their footsteps with it. But
Yeah, I always feel like that's kind of a kind of a cheesy part of it, and just a, I don't know. I mean, maybe there are those that could explain to me why it's a useful thing or why it's a good thing. But for me, of all the intents and purposes, it just seems like it's just kind of like a ritual that people do that has no real use.
yeah,
So that part, but I see how if a person was going to, name the photo differently at some point, that could be an issue. But I don't know. In that case, then you have a really limited edition. If you have, if you have a certificate of authenticity with a different name, maybe that's worth more in the art world. I don't even try to, bother to understand everything that goes on in the quote high end art world. But also, I think I'm a little jaded in that regard.
yeah, yeah, no thanks. I mean,
Yeah.
even limited editions for me, just I go back and forth with it, especially when you're doing a limited editions of like 300,
Yeah.
or even to me, like over 100 is kind of like, yeah, it's limited, but are you realistically gonna sell over 100 prints of that one photograph? Probably not.
Yeah.
I mean, my big thing is I think back to Ansel Adams and Moonrise Hernandez, and the fact that if he had limited that to say 25 prints, his whole career would have been drastically different.
Yeah.
Because that's the one photograph that made his career. It was because he had sold so many photographs or so many prints of that photograph that he was able to not have to worry so much about money anymore. He went from being the quote unquote starving artist to being who we know him and think of him as today because of that. And that's kind of what I look at is if something happens where even if I limit it to say 50 prints per photograph, what happens if I take that one photograph? What happens when I get to my Moonrise Hernandez and 100 people want it?
Yeah.
Now you're either going to be playing a game where, oh yeah, I'm releasing another 50 of this image in these two sizes, like some people like to play, or you're just SOL.
Yeah. It's a tricky subject. Because I know that there are some people who don't do limited editions, or some people that do. I fall into the camp of doing the limited editions, but it's not for a marketing purpose. Like you'll see in some of these quote high-end galleries, where there's a high pressure sales tactics of, oh, you have to buy early and get this one because then the price will go up more and it'll be worth more and this and that. And it's used in a very negative way. It's used in a way that is strictly for marketing. And then at some point, if a person, thinks that this print that they have is worth a lot of money, only to try to resell it on the, on the used market, only to find that it's worth a fraction of what they paid for it. That's definitely an example of a very bad use of limited editions. I've also thought about like what you were thinking about in terms of, if there's that one photo that you take that is the defining image of your career, and then you limit that to, X number of prints, and at some point, you sell through those and then that's that. But also what's interesting is that I've seen that for my own print sales, it's pretty spread evenly across. I mean, not that like every single image people have ordered X number of times, but there's a handful of images that have been purchased more than others, but generally it's pretty evenly spread. And there's not just one image which is just dominating everything else, which I guess gives me hope that maybe there will be a once in a lifetime image at some point in my career.
Do you think so though?
I honestly don't think so.
Because that was something else that Richard Boutwell had mentioned in his interview, was the whole idea that we as photographers are more known for projects and entire portfolios rather than as individual photographs like it was back in the day.
Yeah.
It's not so much like, I think more people will recognize your work for the box sets that you do.
Yeah.
Rather than a single photograph within that box set or that you release.
Yeah. Or like a consistency in a style where people, like, there will be some photographers where you're scrolling through and you see an image. You don't see who it's by. You don't see the title. You don't see anything. You just see the image and you know immediately who shot that photo because of the visual appearance of the photo, the choice of subject, and everything else associated with that.
But even that's tough anymore.
It's true, because some of that's all dependent on like processing and such.
Like there are times where I would look through Instagram or wherever and I'd see a photograph that looked similar to something that you would take and then recognized it as someone totally different.
Yeah.
Just because the world is it's taken up by so many photographers anymore.
Yeah.
And they're all in so many different areas. Mostly in the same areas anymore, to be honest.
Which is true.
So, yeah.
And there was a little while back when I still had my Sony mirrorless camera. It was in early 2021. I was in Zion when there was this really cool snowstorm that went through, and I shot some photos on film, but then I just went around for the rest of the day and shot photos with the Sony with 100 to 400 long lens and just, pulling all these detail shots of things that looked pretty interesting. And it was interesting because I did end up sharing those photos as well. I never did anything with them. I never printed them or anything like that. But when I shared them, someone had an interesting point when they looked at it. They said, it's a cool photo, but it doesn't look like a photo that you would shoot. Like, they're saying, like, I when I looked at it, I didn't immediately recognize it as your work versus, I'll look at your film work and I'll look at that and be like, oh, I know that's, your photo right away. I can pick that out. So I think a lot of it has to do with the choice of subjects, the particular camera that shot it. In the case of film versus digital, there's going to be a little bit of a different look. Perhaps the fact that it was a long lens. So there's some stuff along those lines that comes into play. But when it does come to the limited editions, one of the things that I found is that people get excited about the number. Like if a person is purchasing the first version of that print and they're getting like the number one print, they legitimately get excited about it, which is kind of cool because it does, there's some significance to that. I also have it where I currently have one matched pair, which is these two images that pair very nicely when displayed side by side. One of them is an abstract of some ice. Another one is a fracture and some sandstone. One's kind of bluish, the other is kind of orangish, and they pair really nicely together. And I always try to make sure that if a person buys that matched pair, that they get the same number. It might be like number 7 of 100 and number 7 of 100, because it does give, I think, something special in terms of just not that they feel like it's worth more, but just that the aesthetic of having that on top of everything else. It's almost like you have a well-organized camera bag. I don't know. It sounds like a weird analogy, but like everything is fitting nicely in its place. Everything is organized. Everything is structured, that kind of whole thing. But in terms of, you have these two prints on the wall and they have matching numbers, it kind of gives a little more of a sense of calm of like, oh, they really do match in that regard. So that's why I have not done the certificates of authenticity, but I find that people do get excited about the numbers. And then also with the box sets that I sell each year, and then this year it's not a box set; it's a basically in a paper portfolio, so it's a little bit thinner. So I'm calling them print portfolios this year, but those are a numbered set, and for me that's an edition of 150 because it's so much work to make them, and I'm just like legitimately. After doing 150 of them, I'm like, I'm tired of looking at all this. But people, again, they get excited about having the lower numbers on there. So I think that side of things, when it comes to the limited editions and such, in some ways, perhaps it makes it more tangible. It's like an agreement between you and the person buying the artwork that, this is not a completely mass produced, it won't go on forever. And also to the answer question of like, if you do have that one photo that does perhaps define you as an artist, you can increase the price of that as that particular one goes up, just so that you're not going to be, missing out on stuff later down the line.
See, that's something that always baffled me with limited editions. So when I did limited editions for the art shows primarily, I was doing editions of, I think, 20.
Yeah.
And it made more sense for me to number backwards. So the first person to purchase one got edition 20 of 20.
Yeah.
Second person got 19 of 20, so on and so forth. Because at least how it works in my mind, you should be paying the most for edition 1 out of whatever it is.
Yeah.
If you're going to be raising your prices. That's how it always, because that's how it is in the used market or the aftermarket, after sales kind of thing.
Yeah.
So it always was kind of like, why, I don't know, the whole limited edition thing has always just kind of been a step above my head when it comes to like the high-end market and how it's supposed to be done, because everyone does it different.
Exactly.
Like you have someone like Peter Lick who does editions of 999 and then does another 300 artist proofs.
Yeah.
I mean,
and I still don't understand what
sense.
an artist proof is. Like I hear people say that is it just a way of just appending more images outside the numbers.
So when I was trying to figure this out, I did a little bit of research on it, and I think at one point I'd written up an article or something. But anyway, so limited editions were started when you were doing like block printing and that kind of thing, where you had something, what you were using to make the prints, and like say the film would eventually deteriorate over time. So the whole point of limited editions wasn't necessarily that you were that you had a set amount that you were going to be printing and then that was it.
Yeah.
It was the fact that this block that you were using to print from was degrading with each print.
Yeah.
So the first number 1 out of 100 was the best quality. That was the absolute like epitome of that print. And then by the time that you got to 50 out of 100, it was kind of like, it's still good, but it's not as good as the first one. And then when you got to 100 out of 100, it was just kind of, that was it. That was the last one. That's where limited editions came from. So with artist proofs then, artist proofs were primarily, I think, with like silver gelatin prints and like platinum prints, they're your working prints. They're the ones that you do at the very beginning. They're not quite perfected.
Mm-hmm.
That's what an artist proof is. It's not meant to be the same exact print as the rest of the run. It was, the exposure, I need a little bit more exposure on this area, a little less on this area, but it's still good enough. That's
Yeah.
kind of where that comes from.
So it sounds like it's
So-
just been twisted for marketing's sake.
The entire limited edition, artist proof, all of that has all
Yeah.
been just twisted and so manipulated by the art market that it's confusing now, and it doesn't make
Yeah.
any sense. Like, we have the technology to print endless amounts of a photograph, even from film. Like back in the day of even like Ansel Adams, film negatives really don't degrade.
Yeah.
I mean, they do over time, but it takes so much.
Yeah.
I mean, the only reason that Moonrise Hernandez was stopped, and I think Ansel Adams destroyed that negative, was just because A, he got really sick of printing it, but B, by the time that he had printed, I think like over 1,000 or 1,500 prints from it,
Yeah.
the quality wasn't as good anymore because of the light being constantly blasted through there and all of the things that he had to do to it. So that at that point it makes sense, at least to me, to do a limited edition.
Yeah.
Or like in your case with like the box sets. I mean, that makes sense to me because you're putting a lot of work into doing those. And yeah, realistically you could do those forever. But
Yeah.
I think for me, I think the only reason I would do a limited edition print or run of prints would be if I was doing like contact prints, silver gelatin contacts, or if I was doing like platinum palladium prints or something where it takes a lot of work and effort, but then I'd be selling them at a higher price as well to kind of make up for that.
Yeah.
But then again, that's just me. Like,
Yeah.
there are plenty of people out there who do open editions, and there are plenty of people who do limited editions that probably should just be open editions because of how many they're doing. But
Now, are the open editions usually numbered?
my whole plan with, if I ever do get to selling prints like regularly,
Mm-hmm.
is to, I don't know if I'm going to put it on the face of the mat or on the back of it.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously my signature will go with it, the title of the photograph, the year that it was printed, and then I'll probably include, I think Cole Thompson does it for all of his, just like the number print.
Yeah.
So if it's the first print from that photograph, then go with that, just with no end to it, no like
Yeah.
last number kind of thing.
And that would give the same sort of tangible qualities that I think people do appreciate, or people that have the way that I do things with the limited editions, or a person will get, print number 1 out of 100 or whatever. If it's an open edition with print number 1 is print number 1. I think they're going to feel great about it either way.
Yeah, you would think so. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that actually that's not a bad way of doing things, really, where you can avoid sort of the, all the way that people twist the limited editions from a marketing standpoint.
Yeah. I just don't care for the arbitrary numbering of something that doesn't have to be limited.
Yeah.
I mean, the other thing too is, realistically, the photographs in my portfolio, I just went through my portfolio not too long ago and completely revamped it. I got rid of a ton of photographs. I went from, I think, almost 100 photographs spread throughout like 3 or 4 different galleries,
Uh-huh.
down to 30. Because those are the 30 or so best, in my opinion.
And it reflects what your current perception is on those images.
Right.
And probably also how they pair together in display. I'm guessing that must factor in as well, how they play off each other.
Subconsciously, I'm sure it does.
Yeah.
But even with something like that, like in 2, 3, 4 years, whatever, if I'm selling prints, those prints aren't always going to be the same, or what's offered from my portfolio isn't always going to stay the same. So there's bound to be a limit. And if you really want to go extreme with it, like some people have said about open editions, an open edition is never truly a fully open edition. it's not going to be an unlimited
Yeah.
number, because at some point I'm going to die and not be able to produce.
Yeah.
I'm going to stop being able to produce these prints. So
Yeah.
at some point
Everything's
it's going to be
limited.
limited regardless. Yes. Everything in life is limited to a point.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. That's just my little tangent on limited edition prints.
Yeah. And actually, when you're talking about, having perhaps too many photos, my solution for that is I try to sort of weed images out of the sort of the themed galleries on my website. The trees, the snow and ice, and all these different categories. I'll go through and I'll sometimes, I'll add photos, I'll remove photos. I'm constantly changing things around, changing the order, because I want to make sure that they display pretty well, that the image gets along with the image that's next to it, which is something that's probably more unique to color than black and white, where everything tends to get along much better. But in terms of, if you go to the print section of my website, you'll see some images in there that you don't see in the galleries. And
Interesting.
what I found is that people have a very, very diverse opinion of what they really would like to purchase. So I don't really want to limit things from the standpoint of like, oh, this photo is no longer available for purchase. You may not see it on the gallery. It's not that I don't like that image anymore. I still like that image, but it just, for whatever reason, it's just not displaying well with those other images. In that particular context, but I still will make it available. So you'll see a lot of images in the print section of my website that aren't found other places, just because I found that people do have a rather broad taste when it comes to which images they would like, because perhaps that one image will look really good on a particular wall, but I just maybe can't quite fit it into the gallery. And also I want to limit the numbers a little bit when sharing them on my website, because I think, it's easy to have too many, which makes me think a little bit about with photo books. I was toying with at some point creating another book, and I was speaking with a person who is an expert on that, and saying like, oh, it's going to take me probably about 5-6 more years to get enough images for another book. And he was telling me that somewhere around 40-50 images in a book is plenty for a book.
Yeah,
which
I agree with that.
Which I heard that, and I'm like, that feels like a low number. But at the same time, there's been some photo books that I've looked through that honestly had too many pictures, and you're just like, you're flipping through them, and at a certain point you're like, I need to take a break. This is just like too much. They're not as cohesive as they should be. So I think being able to trim down what you display on your website is important, but perhaps still making those available. And then one other thought, when you're talking a bit earlier about Ansel Adams and Moonrise over Hernandez, I was just picturing him in the darkroom, loading up that negative, preparing to make another print. And it got me thinking a little bit about the discussion that we had in the previous episode, where I was talking about how there's oftentimes we find contrast in life. There's going to be good things, there's going to be bad things. No matter where we are, whether it's in a good place, there's always going to be something bad. When we're in a really bad place, there's always going to be something good. But that really good thing, when we're in a bad place, could be seen as something that's horrible, elsewhere. But I'm just picturing Ansel Adams walking into the darkroom going, all right, moon over Hernandez again. This is my life. I'm just doing, or for him, perhaps that was just an absolute drag. But for anyone else, I'd be like, that's living the dream right there. So just
I think that's also why so first of all, Ansel was such a better technician in the darkroom than he ever would be considered as a photographer. Like, if you would have brought him into, like, if he lived now instead of back then,
yeah,
I don't think he would have ever gotten the fame that he did, notwithstanding the whole change of how people get famous.
Yeah.
Just based off of the fact that his photography, it was so popular because it was of different places that people hadn't really gone to before or hadn't seen as prevalently as we have.
Mm-hmm.
Like the West was largely undiscovered in a photographic sense at that point. And it was his prints that really helped his work shine. And so everything that I've read about him was kind of like the opposite of what you were saying about, like, yeah, he absolutely loved being in the darkroom. From, like I said, this is all obviously my own,
Mm-hmm.
from reading and my own perception of it. But the other thing to keep in mind too is that if you look at the first print of Moonrise and then compare it to one from the 70s, 80s, closer to when he passed away, they're drastically different.
How so?
So the first print of it isn't what you typically see. If you look up Moonrise over in Hernandez, you will see a very dark photograph, very dark sky. The cloud, the primary cloud that's there, is very bright. The actual town and the I believe they're grave markers in the foreground or toward it is again very bright. If you look up the initial printing though, it's all quite flat. It's drastically different. And if I remember right, Ansel had actually taken the negative and almost redeveloped it. He, like I said, he was very good in the darkroom.
Yeah.
To a point where I will never get to. I will never understand because I don't care for the technical so much as I do the creative. But he did something to this that I think increased the contrast by quite a bit and did a bunch of technical voodoo magic to this negative in order to make it into what he started to envision. I mean, even pretty much all of his negatives, all of his prints were toward the end of his life a lot more contrasted than they were in the very beginning and when he first started out, and even towards the middle of his life. He got to a point where he started printing quite dark and a lot moodier almost than what he did in the beginning.
I also wonder if there was any changes in the materials that were available. And you had mentioned that he had some very, he was continuing to refine his technique and come up with more ways, but also isn't that a time when there were some changes within the materials that were available too? I also wonder if that had an impact on things.
Yeah, I'm sure it did. I mean, things were constantly advancing and technology was getting better, especially as we were creeping toward the end of film and beginning of digital toward the end of Ansel's life. So I'm sure, I don't know if he ever changed the chemicals that he used. I know that was always a big fight, so to speak, that he had between himself and Weston. They used different film developers, and they each would banter back and forth with each other about that and which one is better and why and all that kind of thing.
I guess if this was in modern times, there'd just be a bunch of Twitter exchanges and all kinds of flame wars and such,
Kind of why are you shooting Nikon when Sony is so much better kind of thing that we have today.
Yeah.
So,
it seems like that is something that's imprinted into human nature, something that's deep down.
Absolutely.
In a jovial kind of way, I guess, kind of a bonding perhaps kind of way, but some people take it a little too far when it's made very easily accessible with the social media and such these days. I hope you enjoyed our creative banter. You can learn more about Cody's work by visiting his website, codyschultz.com. And you can find my work at benhorn.com. For further discussion, join us at patreon.com/creativebanter. It's a place where we can interact with you, the listener. And although we greatly appreciate those who contribute by joining a tier, discussions are open to everyone, whether you're a paying member or not. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you around next time.